Chapter 1. Fay, the applause. It was on a rain-soaked evening in late October that I found myself in the billiard room of Blackthorn Manor, observing what appeared to be an admirable display of humility. The storm had begun shortly after dusk, advancing across the countryside with a steady persistence that seemed almost deliberate. Rain beat against the tall mullioned windows, tracing crooked paths through the diamond panes before dissolving into darkness. Within, however, the atmosphere was warm and intimate. The billiard room glowed beneath low amber lamps, their shaded light reflected in the deep green felt of the table and in the polished oak panels that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The air carried the faint scent of tobacco and beeswax, mingled with the sharper tang of damp wool, steaming gently near the fire. Mr. Adrian Clark, a gentleman of agreeable manner and recent notoriety, had just concluded a private game with Captain Hastings, known to some from earlier days as Hastings. Hastings, whose military bearing lent him an air of perpetual readiness, stood upright beside the table. Cue still in hand, his broad shoulders squared as though the contest were not entirely over. Clark, by contrast, leaned with studied ease against the edge of the mantelpiece. He was a man of medium height and precise grooming, his dark hair brushed back to reveal a brow that seemed perpetually lifted in mild amusement, with a theatrical clearing of his throat, one so carefully measured that it could scarcely be called spontaneous. Mr. Clark requested the attention of those assembled. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying with effortless clarity across the room, "I owe Hastings an apology." There followed a murmur of polite surprise. Several guests, who had been clustered near the drinks cabinet, turned fully toward him. Lady Marchmont, whose fondness for society was equalled only by her fondness for gossip, raised her lorgnette in anticipation. Earlier in the week, during a dinner of considerable animation, Mr. Clark had allowed himself a sharp remark concerning Hastings's recollection of a campaign in India. It had been a trivial exchange, but in a gathering of cultivated tempers and delicate pride, such trifles could assume greater proportions. I spoke carelessly. Clark continued now, one hand resting lightly over his heart. I questioned the accuracy of Hastings's account when I ought to have admired the courage it represented. I regret the remark sincerely. His eyes shifted briefly toward Hastings, and there passed between them a moment of silence, one that might have been interpreted as reconciliation. Hastings, after the smallest hesitation, inclined his head. "You have my thanks," he replied with gruff dignity. "Let us consider the matter closed." Warm applause filled the room. It began tentatively, as such applause often does, and then gathered strength. Several guests smiled approvingly. A few even exchanged satisfied glances, as though they had witnessed not merely an apology, but a small triumph of civility in an age increasingly lacking in it. Yet I, Hercule Poirot, who have studied the music of deception as a conductor studies the score, heard within that applause a discordant note. The apology had arrived too precisely, too neatly placed within the social choreography of the evening. It resembled a cue ball striking not by accident, but by design, its trajectory calculated long before it met its target. I observed not the words themselves, but the direction in which they were aimed. Clark's gaze, though it rested upon Hastings as he spoke, had not remained there. It had flickered, subtly, almost imperceptibly, toward three individuals in particular: Miss Eleanor Marchmont, niece to Sir Reginald Marchmont, Mr. Leonard Price, Clark's business associate, and Dr. Sebastian Rowley, the local physician and a man of reserved temperament. Each, in turn, responded differently. Miss Marchmont smiled, yet her smile was brittle, like glass under strain. She clasped her hands together as though relieved by the scene's resolution, but her fingers were tense. Mr. Price nodded approvingly, though his eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before smoothing into polite approval. He was a man of practical aspect, with spectacles that caught the lamplight and a habit of adjusting them when unsettled. Dr. Rowley's applause came a moment late, restrained and almost reluctant. He stood slightly apart from the others, one hand resting on the back of a leather chair. When he did clap, it was with the smallest movement, as though the gesture had been required of him rather than offered. His expression was unreadable, yet the pulse at his temple betrayed a momentary quickening. It was not Hastings's forgiveness that interested me. It was the effect of that apology upon the room. Applause can serve many purposes. It can express admiration, relief, or even obedience. Here, it seemed to accomplish something else entirely. It sealed an impression. It confirmed a narrative. Adrian Clark, the man who admits his faults. Adrian Clark, the gracious gentleman. Adrian Clark, restored to moral equilibrium before a discerning audience. Such impressions, once planted, are not easily dislodged. The host of Blackthorn Manor, Sir Reginald Marchmont, entered at that moment, his silver hair slightly disordered from a brisk inspection of the grounds. He clapped Clark warmly on the shoulder. "Well said, my boy. Well said. It takes a brave man to admit an error." Even those among the guests who understood little of billiards could appreciate the quiet authority with which he commanded the table. Yet at that particular turn, when the white ball lay invitingly poised for what should have been a simple cannon, his cue faltered by the smallest fraction. The ball glanced wide, striking only one of its intended targets before rolling to an unremarkable halt. A minor error, nothing more. Yet in a room attuned to competition, it drew attention. Several heads turned, a few eyebrows lifted discreetly. Captain Hastings straightened, masking his irritation with admirable composure, but the moment lingered. And in that moment, Clark moved. He cleared his throat and raised his voice with a fluidity that suggested rehearsal. The apology followed at once, swift as a curtain descending between Hastings and the gaze of the room. All eyes shifted in a single, obedient motion. I glanced at the mantel clock. 9 minutes past 10. Why apologize at that instant? Why not earlier? When the room was more relaxed and the game concluded, why not privately? As any truly contrite gentleman might prefer. An apology delivered publicly is seldom intended for only one pair of ears. It is a performance, a repositioning. And in that room, someone needed to be repositioned, morally and strategically. I replayed the sequence in my mind with the care of a chess player reviewing his opening moves. First, Hastings's rare lapse, drawing attention and perhaps faint embarrassment. Second, Clark's immediate intervention, transforming Hastings from subject of scrutiny into recipient of honor. Third, the applause, warm, enthusiastic, and collective. In an instant, the narrative shifted. Hastings was no longer the man who had faltered. He became the wronged party graciously restored. And Clark, by orchestrating that restoration, emerged as magnanimous and self-aware. But who benefited most from this rearrangement? As the guests drifted toward the salon, I observed them closely. Sir Reginald Marchmont appeared, satisfied, as though the evening had been preserved from awkwardness. His affection for orderly decorum was well known. A public apology soothed him. It affirmed his belief that Blackthorn Manor remained a sanctuary of civility. Miss Eleanor Marchmont, however, seemed less assured. She walked beside her uncle with deliberate slowness, her expression composed yet strained. I had noticed earlier that she watched the billiard match with unusual intensity, not merely as spectator, but as participant in some private calculation. Mr. Leonard Price conversed animatedly with Clark, yet there was a faint tightness at the corners of his mouth. Price was a man accustomed to figures and forecasts. His partnership with Clark in recent ventures had reportedly yielded remarkable profits, though I have long observed that remarkable profits are often accompanied by remarkable risks. And Dr. Sebastian Rowley remained withdrawn, his gaze thoughtful, almost troubled. 9 minutes past 10. The specificity of the hour appealed to me. It was neither too early in the evening to be inconsequential, nor too late to be dismissed as fatigue. The guests were alert, the atmosphere lively. Every word spoken would be retained with clarity. As we entered the salon, I found myself beside Captain Hastings. "You were unfortunate in that last shot," I remarked lightly. He gave a short laugh. "Confounded careless of me. I cannot account for it. The angle was simple enough." "You are certain you were not distracted?" "Distracted by what? By whom?" I corrected gently. He considered this. "Well, Clark had been speaking rather loudly behind me before the shot. Something about market fluctuations. It was devilish distracting, now that I think of it." "Ah, So he was already commanding attention. Yes, though no one was paying him much heed at the time. I nodded. It is a curious fact that the human mind, when anticipating interruption, may falter at the decisive instant. A slight disturbance, a cough, a movement in peripheral vision can alter precision. If Clark had indeed been speaking with increasing volume before Hastings's stroke, then the apology that followed was not spontaneous. It was the culmination of a carefully constructed sequence. First, create distraction. Second, allow error. Third, redeem publicly. Such choreography requires foresight. But foresight for what purpose? I seated myself in a high-backed chair near the fire and accepted a small cup of coffee. My eyes traveled the room slowly. The billiard room, in daylight, possessed an entirely different character. The amber lamps of the previous evening were extinguished. In their place, pale morning light streamed through tall windows, revealing every detail without indulgence. The polished wood panels gleamed coolly. The green felt of the table appeared almost severe in its clarity. The chalk still rested where it had lain the night before, beside the cushion. I noted the faint crescent of blue at the tip of the cue Hastings had used. Such small physical traces often remain indifferent to human drama, yet they bear silent witness. The arrangement of the balls had, naturally, been restored to order by attentive servants. But I had observed their approximate positions with sufficient care to reconstruct the critical shot. "If you would be so good," I said, gesturing toward the table, "demonstrate precisely what you attempted." Hastings selected his cue with the ease of long familiarity. His posture was upright, his expression determined. "You are making a mountain out of a molehill," he muttered, though not without good humor. "Perhaps," I replied. "But even molehills cast shadows." We placed the balls carefully, the red and yellow positioned at modest distance from one another, the white at an angle requiring finesse rather than force. It was not difficult, Hastings insisted. A simple cannon, strike the red, rebound to the yellow. "Yes," I said softly, "a simple cannon, provided one's concentration is undisturbed." He bent to the shot, aligning his sight along the cue. I observed not only the balls, but Hastings himself, the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of his breath, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he gauged the angle. He drew the cue back. In that suspended instant before impact, the room seemed to narrow to a line, cue ball in tension. He struck. The white ball glided forward, contacted the red cleanly, then rebounded to kiss the yellow with admirable precision. The sound, a crisp, satisfying click, echoed lightly. "There," he said, straightening, "perfectly straightforward." "Indeed," I murmured. "Now let us consider the interruption." He frowned. "You are convinced Clark meant to distract me?" "I am convinced," I said carefully, "that he chose his moment with deliberation." I began to pace slowly around the table, tracing sightlines. From the doorway, one commanded an unobstructed view of the player's stance and timing. From the window alcove, however, the perspective was partial. A tall fern and the curve of the wall limited direct observation of the precise instant of contact. "Where did Clark stand before he spoke?" I asked. "Near the doorway," Hastings replied. "Just behind my right shoulder. Close enough to observe your preparation." "Yes." "And was he speaking prior to your stroke?" Hastings paused. "Now that you mention it, yes, he was discussing something with Price. Investments, I think." His voice grew louder. Gradually, yes, it seemed to build. "Ah. A man intent upon sudden distraction may shout abruptly, but a man intent upon control increases volume incrementally, so that when he finally interjects, the room is already attuned to his presence." "When did he clear his throat?" I asked. "Just as I began to release the cue," Hastings said slowly. "I had drawn it back, then he spoke. The moment before impact, an interruption placed precisely where concentration is most fragile. I positioned myself where Clark had stood. From that vantage, I could anticipate the instant of release by observing the player's posture. The timing would require attention, but Clark was a man of keen attention. Suppose he intended Hastings to miss, a slight distraction, delivered at the moment of execution, would suffice. The shot would fail, Not spectacularly, but noticeably, attention would shift to the error. And in that heightened focus, Clark would rise, clear his throat, and assume command of the narrative. The apology would follow. I turned to Hastings. "Did you feel, for a fraction of a second, uncertain?" I asked. He hesitated. "Yes, confounded odd, really. I thought I had misjudged the angle. And afterward, I doubted myself only briefly. Self-doubt is subtle. It requires only the smallest crack." If Clark could induce that doubt, the billiard room's western wall was occupied by a tall mahogany cabinet with glass panels. Within it were displayed antique cues, silver trophies, and various relics of sporting history. In the lamplight, the glass served as a muted mirror, reflecting fragments of the room at oblique angles. "I could not see the table directly from where I stood," she continued, "but I could see Mr. Clark's reflection. And what did that reflection reveal? He was not watching Hastings. No. He glanced toward the study corridor. The study corridor, a narrow passage extending from the far end of the billiard room, leading toward the late Mr. Marcus Whitfield's office. The name required no embellishment. Marcus Whitfield had served as Sir Reginald Marchmont's financial advisor for more than 15 years. A man of severe intellect and meticulous habit, he was not beloved, but he was respected. 2 nights prior, he had been found seated at his desk, lifeless. The physician had attributed the death to heart failure, a conclusion both plausible and expedient, given Whitfield's known cardiac condition. Yet suddenness has a way of inviting scrutiny. "You are certain of this glance?" I asked. "As certain as reflection allows," she said. "It was not casual, it was measured." "Measured?" "Yes, as though he were confirming something." The nuance of that phrase lingered. "Confirming what?" I asked. She shook her head. "I do not know, but it was not the glance of a man about to offer spontaneous contrition." 5 applauded. 1 observed. "Did you speak of this to anyone?" I inquired. Number it would have sounded absurd. "Why absurd?" "Because an apology is not a crime, indeed," I said quietly. "But timing may reveal intention." She regarded me carefully now. "You believe Mr. Whitfield's death was not as simple as it appeared?" "I believe," I replied, "that when reputation is suddenly polished in public view, one must ask who expects it to be examined." She did not dispute this. "There were disagreements," she said after a moment. "Between whom?" "Mr. Whitfield and Mr. Clark. Regarding investments, my uncle had entrusted Clark with several ventures Whitfield considered excessively ambitious. Dangerous? Yes, and these disagreements were recent, within the past fortnight. The chronology tightened. Mr. Whitfield challenges Clark's financial conduct. Whitfield dies suddenly. 2 nights later, Clark performs an impeccably timed public display of humility before all relevant witnesses. The pattern, though not yet proof, was compelling. "On the evening of Mr. Whitfield's death," I asked, "where was Mr. Clark?" "At dinner with us," she replied. "He left briefly to take a telephone call." "From where?" "From the study, the same study." "Yes, convenience again." "When was Mr. Whitfield discovered?" "The following morning. He had not appeared for breakfast." "And the door?" "It was locked from within." "Windows?" "Closed." The classic architecture of finality. Who forced entry? "My uncle and Dr. Rowley." "And the doctor confirmed heart failure immediately?" "Yes." "Without hesitation?" "Yes." I allowed silence to stretch between us, not uncomfortably, but with purpose. "Miss Marchmont," I said at last, "when 5 people applaud, they affirm not merely words but character. Mr. Clark ensured that all present witnessed his humility. And you believe that was necessary?" "I believe he anticipated scrutiny." Her composure wavered for the first time. "If Whitfield discovered something," she said slowly, "something irregular, then Whitfield became an obstacle." "And obstacles," she whispered, "are sometimes removed." Yes. Outside the window, the mist had begun to lift, revealing sharper outlines in the garden below. Clarity, though gradual, was inevitable. "One final question," I said during the apology. "Did Mr. Clark appear relieved?" She considered. "No," she said. "He appeared prepared." Prepared? There is a profound difference between relief and preparation. Relief follows uncertainty. Preparation precedes action. 5 witnesses remembered humility, 1 remembered direction. And I, Hercule Poirot, do not believe in coincidences of timing when death and drama share a stage. If Mr. Marcus Whitfield died of natural causes, then Mr. Clark's apology was merely theatrical. But if Whitfield's death concealed intention, then that apology was not redemption. It was insulation. And insulation is rarely installed without expectation of fire. Chapter 5 Fee the study, Mr. Marcus Whitfield's study, bore the solemn dignity of a man who trusted routine. There are rooms that betray the temperament of their occupant, the instant one crosses the threshold. Whitfield's was not a chamber of ornament, nor of indulgence. It was a room constructed for order. The desk, broad and immaculately arranged, faced the tall window overlooking the east lawn. Shelves climbed the walls in rigid symmetry, each volume aligned with near military precision. The carpet bore no sign of careless pacing. Even the fire grate had been cleared of excess ash with methodical restraint. A man who respects structure leaves traces of that respect in wood and paper. I entered accompanied by Dr. Sebastian Rowley and Sir Reginald Marchmont. The latter moved heavily, as though the air within the study carried the lingering weight of personal loss. "You understand," Sir Reginald said gravely. "The doctor has already examined everything. There was no indication of foul play." Dr. Rowley inclined his head. Mr. Whitfield's heart had been unreliable for years. Sudden failure is not unusual in such cases. "Of course," I murmured politely. "And yet it is my habit to observe for myself." They withdrew discreetly, leaving me alone with the quiet authority of the room. The desk commanded immediate attention. Papers were stacked in disciplined order, ledgers balanced neatly atop correspondence, envelopes sealed and labeled in Whitfield's precise hand. Nothing lay scattered, no chair overturned, no sign of physical distress. On the right side of the desk rested a single brandy glass. It was not empty. A modest measure of amber liquid clung to its base, catching the afternoon light in a thin, refracted glow. Beside it lay an open ledger and a fountain pen placed carefully parallel to the page margin. The tableau suggested interruption, not violence. A man seated at his desk, reviewing accounts, pausing perhaps to sip brandy, a tightening in the chest collapse. So it would appear, yet something troubled me. I moved first to the window. It was latched from within. The brass mechanism showed no sign of tampering. The glass panes were clean, uncracked. From this height, entry from outside would have been improbable without leaving obvious marks. The curtains, however, attracted my attention. They were drawn partially to one side, not dramatically, but unevenly. The fabric bore the faint impression of recent handling. I placed my fingers lightly against the fold. The dust had been disturbed. Had Whitfield drawn them himself? Perhaps. But routine men tend toward consistent gestures. A man who lives by order rarely leaves asymmetry behind him. I returned to the desk. The brandy glass. I lifted it gently, bringing it toward my nose. Alcohol rose first. Rich, warm, expected. Beneath it, faint yet unmistakable, lingered another scent. Bitter almond. It was subtle, so subtle that one might dismiss it entirely. Yet once perceived, it could not be ignored. Bitter almond is not an aroma that belongs in brandy. Cyanide, administered with intelligence, may masquerade as illness. It arrests the body swiftly, leaving signs easily mistaken for cardiac failure, particularly in a man already known to suffer from weakness of the heart. I replaced the glass carefully. Poison requires opportunity. Opportunity requires access. Access requires trust. And trust is built not in private, but in public. An apology, perhaps, is an investment in credibility. I seated myself at Whitfield's desk and examined the ledger before me. Columns of figures marched across the page in disciplined formation. Several entries were circled in firm ink beside them. Marginal notes in Whitfield's hand. Brief, decisive loan notation drew my eye. transfer pending approval, A.C. Adrian Clark. The amount referenced was considerable. I turned several pages backward. Similar annotations appeared. Transfers initiated. Approvals requested. Reservations noted in the margin. Whitfield had not been complacent. He had been scrutinizing. On the corner of the desk lay a sealed envelope addressed to Sir Reginald. The seal remained unbroken. I did not open it. Instead, I examined the pen. Its nib bore fresh ink. It had not been left to dry. Whatever Whitfield had been writing, he had done so shortly before his death. I leaned back slightly, reconstructing the sequence. Whitfield sits, reviews figures, perhaps discovers discrepancy, perhaps resolves to confront Clark again. He pours brandy, whether habitually or in contemplation. He drinks, within minutes, the poison axe. If cyanide, death would have been rapid. Dr. Rowley had found no sign of struggle. The body had remained seated, a man taken unaware. I rose and moved to the door. The lock was solid. Sir Reginald had told me the door was forced the following morning, when Whitfield failed to appear at breakfast. The key had been found inside. A locked room, but poison does not require intrusion at the moment of death. It requires only prior preparation. When had the brandy been poured? Who had access to it? On a sideboard stood a decanter and 2 additional glasses, both untouched. I lifted the decanter. The scent was clean, no trace of bitterness. I poured a small amount into a fresh glass and examined it carefully, pure. Thus, the poison had not been introduced into the decanter. It had been introduced into the individual glass, which implies proximity, which implies familiarity. Whitfield would not have accepted a drink from a stranger without question, but from someone he knew, someone who could enter his study without raising alarm. Yes, opportunity requires credibility. 2 nights prior, Mr. Clark had left dinner briefly to take a telephone call in the study corridor. He had been alone for several minutes. Was Whitfield present in the study? At that time, Sir Reginald had confirmed that Whitfield worked late. Thus, Clark had opportunity. But opportunity alone is insufficient. One must ask, what motive would compel such action? Financial motive is rarely abstract. It leaves traces. I returned to the ledger and located the largest circled entry. The figure represented a substantial allocation into one of Clark's ventures, a speculative enterprise described as Northern Consolidated Holdings. Beside the figure, Whitfield had written, excessive exposure. Recommend review. Your commend review. A threat, not personal, but professional. If Whitfield intended to advise Sir Reginald against further investment, Clark's position could weaken considerably. If Whitfield possessed documentation of irregularity, then Whitfield's continued scrutiny became dangerous. I approached the fireplace. The grate was clean, but within the ash I detected faint remnants of recently burned paper. The fragments were too small to reconstruct fully, yet one piece bore the partial imprint of a letterhead. Consolidated, interesting. Had Whitfield burned documents before his death, or had someone burned them afterward? I knelt closer. The ash was cool, yet its distribution suggested deliberate placement. Not the careless scattering of old correspondence, but a selective destruction. I rose slowly. A man of routine does not burn papers impulsively. If Whitfield destroyed documents, he did so intentionally, unless they were destroyed by another. I returned to the desk once more and allowed my gaze to settle upon the brandy glass. Bitter almond, faint, deliberate. A man seeking to mask poison as natural death would choose his moment carefully. He would ensure that his own character appeared above suspicion. He would cultivate, in advance, the image of humility and moral steadiness. He would apologize publicly. He would ensure applause. Thus, when death was recalled, his name would evoke virtue rather than scrutiny. Credibility is the most valuable currency in crime, and Mr. Adrian Clark, I suspected, had invested heavily in it at 10:09. I replaced everything precisely as I had found it and stepped toward the door. The study remained dignified, orderly, controlled. But beneath that order lay disturbance. Poison does not shout, it whispers, and whispers are heard only by those who listen carefully. As I extinguished the lamp upon the desk and closed the door behind me, one thought settled with quiet certainty. Mr. Whitfield had not merely died. He had been removed, and someone in Blackthorn Manor believed that applause could conceal the sound of that removal. Chapter 6. Fay. The ledger did not yield its secrets at once. It lay upon Mr. Whitfield's desk with the restrained authority of a document accustomed to scrutiny and resistant to drama. Its dark leather binding was smooth at the edges, worn by years of disciplined use rather than neglect. The pages within were thick and faintly cream in tone, ruled in precise columns. Nothing in its appearance suggested haste, agitation, or deceit. It was the book of a man who believed in structure. Yet, I have observed that deception often prefers order to chaos. Disorder attracts suspicion, order disarms it. I seated myself deliberately at the desk and turned the pages backward from the final entry, not hurriedly, but with the patience of one who listens for subtle discord within harmony. The numbers marched in obedient lines: investments, dividends, One entry in particular drew my attention. A transfer scheduled but not executed. Beside it, Whitfield had written, pending signature delay. Delay, perhaps Whitfield had refused immediate authorization. If Clark faced imminent obstruction, if Whitfield intended to withhold signature pending review, then urgency intensified. The meeting at 9:30 becomes not routine but critical. I paced the length of the study, my hands clasped lightly behind my back. A man seeking forgiveness in public may be securing an alibi for private sins. Clark's apology had been delivered with impeccable timing. It diverted attention from Hastings's missed shot. It commanded the room. It positioned Clark as humble, honorable, self-correcting. Should suspicion arise regarding Whitfield's death, witnesses would recall Clark's demeanor. They would remember his contrition, his civility, his presence among them. Shortly after 10, memory, once framed by emotion, becomes selective. They would not reconstruct precisely where he had been at 9:40. 5, they would remember applause. I returned to the ledger once more and closed it gently. Motive had emerged, not through confession, but through arithmetic. Irregular figures, escalating exposure, threatened review, an urgent meeting, death intervening before clarification. The structure was forming. Yet structure alone is not proof. I must still establish means, confirm opportunity, and eliminate alternative explanations. Dr. Rowley had declared heart failure swiftly. Was that conclusion based upon thorough examination or assumption? Miss Marchmont had observed Clark glance toward the study corridor before delivering his apology. Why glance? Unless confirming something, had he been ensuring that no disturbance emerged? Time is the architect of crime. It dictates sequence. It reveals contradiction. 9:30, meeting scheduled. Approximately 9:45, poison administered. Before 10, Whitfield incapacitated. 9 minutes past 10, apology delivered. The symmetry was elegant, too elegant to dismiss. I extinguished the lamp upon the desk and stood in the quiet of the study. Mr. Marcus Whitfield had intended to protect his employer's estate. He had recorded irregularities with disciplined clarity. He had summoned the man responsible for explanation. He died before that explanation could be resolved. And Mr. Adrian Clark ensured that within the hour, his own character stood publicly burnished. The ledger had not accused him directly, but it had supplied the most essential element in any investigation: motive, carefully written in ink, awaiting interpretation. And I, Hercule Poirot, do not ignore ink when it begins to speak. Chapter 7. Fay the Recreation. There are moments in an inquiry when testimony must surrender to geometry. Human beings speak with confidence about where they stood, what they saw, how they moved. Yet space itself is impartial. A doorway does not adjust to convenience. A sightline does not bend to memory. When accounts conflict, one must return to the room and ask it to speak. It was with this purpose that I requested Mr. Adrian Clark to reenact his movements of the evening in question. He complied readily, too readily. We assembled in the billiard room shortly after luncheon. Present were Captain Hastings, Miss Eleanor Marchmont, and Dr. Rowley. Sir Reginald, citing fatigue, had excused himself. I preferred the smaller audience. Recreations require concentration rather than spectacle. The daylight once again rendered the room candid. The amber softness of the previous night had vanished, replaced by clarity. The green baize of the table appeared almost clinical in its smoothness. The polished floor reflected the window light in muted streaks. "Mr. Clark," I began pleasantly, "you will indulge me in a simple reconstruction, nothing theatrical, merely the truth placed in its proper coordinates." He smiled faintly. "If it will settle the matter, of course." His tone suggested confidence untroubled by scrutiny. "You have stated," I continued, "that from 9 o'clock onward you remained in this room. That is correct. You did not leave at any point. Number. Very good. Kindly position yourself precisely where you stood when Hastings attempted his final shot." Without hesitation, Clark moved to the doorway, placing himself just behind and slightly to the right of where Captain Hastings would have been positioned at the table. "Here," he said lightly. "I recall leaning against the frame." "Excellent." I turned to Hastings. "Captain, if you please, assume your stance." Hastings obliged, selecting a cue and positioning himself for the reconstructed cannon shot. I observed carefully, from Clark's claimed position, flush against the doorway. His line of sight, to the exact angle of the cue, was partially obstructed by Hastings's shoulder and the corner of the mantel. "Tell me, Mr. Clark," I said mildly, "from that position, could you clearly see Hastings's cue strike the ball?" "Certainly." I stepped beside him and adjusted my own perspective. "No," I said quietly, "you could not." He frowned slightly. "I assure you I could. Permit me." I asked Hastings to lean forward precisely as he had before, from Clark's declared spot. The lower portion of the cue and the moment of contact were obscured, unless one stepped closer to the table by at least 1.5 feet. "To observe the failed contact," I explained calmly, "you would have needed to move nearer." Clark hesitated. "Only briefly." "Perhaps I did," he conceded. "One does not remember inches." "Inches," I replied, "often determine events." I gestured for him to reposition himself nearer the table. He complied, stepping forward with measured composure. "Yes," he said, "that feels correct." Miss Marchmont, who had remained near the fireplace, spoke quietly. "No," she said. All eyes turned toward her. "You were not standing there when he missed the shot." Clark's expression remained composed. "Are you certain?" "Yes. Where was I then?" "You had approached the corridor." A silence settled upon the room. "The corridor," Clark repeated, almost amused. "Yes, I saw you in the reflection of the glass cabinet. You moved briefly toward the study passage before returning." "That is impossible," he replied smoothly. "I never left the room." "Perhaps not entirely," she said, "but you stepped toward the corridor. I watched him closely. His posture remained upright, his breathing even. Yet there was the faintest tightening along the jaw." "Miss Marchmont may have misinterpreted reflection," he said. "Reflections," I observed, "are frequently more honest than direct vision." To advance the matter beyond recollection, I turned my attention to the floor. The green baize of the table extended only so far. Beyond it lay polished boards of dark oak. Near the doorway adjoining the corridor, and closer still to the side entrance leading toward the garden, I knelt. "There," I said softly. A faint scuff marked the baize near the threshold. It was subtle, no more than a small discoloration at the edge where felt met wood, but its hue was distinct, a trace of dried earth. I ran a fingertip lightly across it. "Captain," I asked, "were your shoes wet that evening?" Number I had come directly from the drawing room. Polished leather. "Yes, and Mr. Clark." He glanced down, also polished. "Dr. Rowley." "Slippers." the doctor replied. I rose slowly. Rain had fallen heavily that night. The garden paths would have been soft with mud. There existed a side entrance adjoining the study corridor, a smaller door, often used by servants during fair weather, though seldom in a storm. If someone had entered from the garden after 9:30, perhaps leaving the study and seeking discreet re-entry, mud might cling briefly to the sole. The scuff was not large, but it did not correspond to Hastings's polished shoes. "Mr. Clark," I said gently, "did you at any point that evening step outside?" "Numbered, did you approach the garden entrance?" "Certainly not." "And yet," I continued quietly, "there is mud upon the baize near that doorway." He looked down at the mark. "Servants," he suggested lightly. "Servants," I repeated, "do not cross the baize during play." No one contradicted this. I allowed silence to lengthen, not accusingly, but inevitably. "Let us reconstruct. At 9:30. Clark meets Whitfield in the study. If poison is administered, and Whitfield collapses, Clark may choose to exit not through the main corridor immediately, but through the side garden door, ensuring no immediate observation by guests who might be lingering nearby. He could then circle discreetly and re-enter the house at a different point, composing himself before joining the others. Rain would render the ground soft, a trace of mud might cling. Returning to the billiard room shortly before 10, he positions himself near the doorway. He observes Hastings's shot. He times the interruption. He apologizes. Applause follows. Time is reconciled. The sequence requires only minutes and composure. I straightened. "Mr. Clark," I said evenly, "you have stated that you did not leave this room after 9. That is correct. Yet Miss Marchmont observed movement toward the corridor, and the floor records the presence of mud, inconsistent with the known footwear of those assembled." His eyes met mine directly. "You imply," he said calmly, "that I left to commit murder and returned to apologize for a trivial remark." "I imply nothing," I replied softly. "I reconstruct." Hastings shifted uneasily. Dr. Rowley remained expressionless. Clark folded his arms. "Even if I had stepped briefly into the corridor," he said, "that proves nothing, and mud may be tracked in by anyone." "Indeed," I agreed, "mud proves little in isolation, but combined with timing, with ledger entries, with scent." He did not respond. The recreation had accomplished its purpose, and intention, once recognized, becomes evidence. The room remained silent long after I ceased speaking. Applause, when remembered honestly, can sound very different indeed. Chapter 9. The confrontation. It was in the billiard room that I chose to conclude the matter. There are houses in which a crime feels like an intruder, an ugly foreign thing that cannot belong. Blackthorn Manor was not such a house, not because it lacked decency or warmth, but because it possessed something far more dangerous, a devotion to appearances. The oak paneling, the amber lamps, the green baize, these were not merely furnishings. They were props in a long-running play called respectability, and when respectability becomes a performance, it is an easy stage upon which to commit a darker performance still. I asked that the household assemble after dinner, at an hour when the day's small distractions had been set aside, and minds were compelled to focus. Servants moved quietly, closing doors, drawing curtains, renewing the fire until it gave a steady, controlled heat. The storm had not returned, but the air outside was damp, and the windows wore a thin sheen that caught the light like dull metal. Sir Reginald Marchmont arrived first. He came slowly, leaning upon his cane, and yet there was a stiffness about him that was not physical. It was the stiffness of a man bracing himself against knowledge he did not wish to possess. Lady Marchmont followed, carrying her composure like a shawl pulled too tightly around her shoulders. Captain Hastings stood near the hearth in an attitude of protective readiness, as though his body still believed that trouble could be met by standing squarely in front of it. Dr. Sebastian Rowley remained near the doorway, a choice that suggested habit more than intention. Physicians, I have observed, prefer positions from which they may leave quickly if emotion overwhelms reason. Mr. Leonard Price slipped in with a cautious air, avoiding the center of the room and taking a chair slightly behind Sir Reginald. His spectacles caught the lamp glow, concealing his eyes whenever he lowered his gaze. Miss Eleanor Marchmont stood near the mantel, exactly as she had stood on the night of the apology. Quiet, watchful, her hands lightly clasped, as though she were holding herself steady. Last to enter was Mr. Adrian Clark. He did not rush. He did not lurk. He walked into the room with the ease of a man who believes he has nothing to hide, and perhaps even more significantly, of a man who believes he is admired. His attire was immaculate. His expression was attentive, politely neutral, and not without a trace of faint amusement. An amusement that might have been directed at the solemnity of the gathering, or perhaps at my insistence upon what he might have considered melodrama. When the door was closed behind him, the billiard room felt sealed, not trapped. Exactly. Blackthorn Manor was large enough to make any word seem small, but sealed, as a letter is sealed before it is opened and read. I allowed a moment to pass, not from hesitation, but because silence can be a tool. It draws attention. It compels the room to lean inward. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said at last, "I must ask you to listen with patience. The truth, like a fine mechanism, must be presented in the order of its parts. If one seizes upon a single piece and declares it decisive, one will misunderstand the whole." Sir Reginald's fingers tightened around the head of his cane. "I begin," I continued, "with Mr. Marcus Whitfield." A shadow moved across Lady Marchmont's face at the sound of the name. Dr. Rowley's posture became fractionally more rigid, as though his professional certainty were preparing itself for challenge. "Mr. Whitfield was found dead in his study," I said. The conclusion offered was heart failure. It was a plausible conclusion. He had, we are told, a history of cardiac weakness. He worked late. He drank brandy. He died in his chair. For many people, the story would end there. I turned slightly, so that the lamplight fell upon my hands as I spoke. People listen more intently, I have found, when they see that the speaker is not gesturing wildly but presenting facts with calm restraint. Yet there were details that did not belong to a simple death. The curtains at the study window were disturbed, as though recently handled, a small matter perhaps. But Mr. Whitfield was a man of routine, and routine men do not leave their rooms in careless disarray. More importantly, upon the desk was a brandy glass containing a residue of drink. When I examined that glass, I detected beneath the alcohol a faint scent, bitter almond. Lady Marchmont made a small sound, and immediately pressed her lips together to suppress it. Sir Reginald's face went pale. "Bitter almond," I repeated quietly. "A scent that is not a feature of brandy. It is associated, as Dr. Rowley will know, with certain poisons." Dr. Rowley's eyes narrowed. "There are other explanations. The sense of smell can be misled." "It can," I agreed. "That is why I did not rely upon it alone. I considered the decanter from which the brandy was presumably poured. The decanter contained no such scent. If it had been contaminated, the smell would have been stronger and not confined to a single glass. But the decanter was clean. Therefore, whatever produced that faint bitterness was introduced into one glass only. I let that settle. It is one thing to say, poison. It is another to show the room how poison must have been placed, by a hand near the victim, at a precise moment, with deliberate intent. Sir Reginald swallowed. "You are telling us." "I am telling you," I said, "that Mr. Whitfield did not die by accident. He was poisoned." The word hung in the air, in my experience. The first response to such a word is not fury but disbelief. People dislike the idea that an orderly world can be disrupted so neatly. Mr. Clark's expression did not change. If anything, his gaze sharpened slightly, as though he were watching how the room would react and calculating how best to position himself within that reaction. "And now," I continued, "we must ask, why was he poisoned? Who benefited from his death?" I moved toward the billiard table, resting my fingertips upon the edge of the green baize. The touch was symbolic, and symbols matter. This table had been the center of attention on the night of the apology. It was fitting that it should be the center of attention now. "In the ledger upon Mr. Whitfield's desk," I said, "I found irregularities, figures amended in careful ink, so careful that one might think the alterations were harmless corrections, shares transferred discreetly. Investments increased in a manner that suggested not natural growth but pressure, and within those entries a name appeared more than once." I looked directly at Adrian Clark. "Mr. Clark." Price's head jerked up. Sir Reginald made a low, pained sound. Clark's voice was smooth. "I have business dealings with Sir Reginald. It is no secret." "Indeed," I replied. "And it is no crime to have one's name in a ledger, but it becomes significant when those ledger entries indicate risk, concealment, and urgency." I held up my hand slightly, as if balancing points upon it. A failed investment is unpleasant. A failed investment that has been presented as secure may become scandalous. A failed investment that has been concealed through amended figures becomes dangerous. Mr. Whitfield, as Sir Reginald's advisor, had begun to detect such danger. He circled entries. He underlined warnings. He wrote notes about exposure, incomplete documentation, and the need for review. I turned one page of memory as though turning a physical page. "And on the night of his death," I said, "he scheduled an urgent meeting." I paused deliberately before delivering the time, because times are bones. They support everything. It was noted for 9:30. Captain Hastings shifted his weight. Lady Marchmont stared at the floor. Dr. Rowley's gaze moved almost unwillingly toward Clark. Clark's expression remained composed. "Yes," he said, "Mr. Whitfield and I met." "You admit the meeting?" I asked. "I do not deny it. Why should I? We spoke of business." "And did you remain in the study long?" "Not particularly." "Did you drink?" "Not in the study." "Did Mr. Whitfield drink?" Clark gave the smallest shrug. He was fond of brandy. He often took a glass when working late. I did not pour it for him. I inclined my head as though acknowledging the statement. One must never appear eager to pounce. Eagerness makes one look unsure. "Let us consider," I said, "the interval between 9:30 and 10. The room grew very still. Even the fire sounded quieter. "Dr. Rowley," I continued, "you estimated Mr. Whitfield's death occurred sometime between 9 and 10. "Yes," he said. "That remains my medical opinion." "Very good. Now, Mr. Clark," I said, "you have claimed that from 9 onward you were present in this billiard room." Clark smiled faintly. "Yes," continuously. "Yes, not leaving at any point." Number I allowed a silence of 2 seconds. Long enough to be noticed, short enough to remain controlled. "Then you see the difficulty," I said gently. "You have admitted meeting Mr. Whitfield at 9:30. Yet you claim to have been in this room from 9 onward. Both statements cannot be true." Price's face tightened. Sir Reginald's eyes widened as if the air itself had changed. Clark's smile thinned. "You twist my words. I said I was in the billiard room from 9 onward that evening, meaning from the time I joined the others." "Ah," I said softly, "meaning from the time you wish to be remembered." That sentence, delivered calmly, caused a visible ripple. People dislike being told that their memory has been used. It makes them feel foolish, and pride is easily wounded. I turned toward Miss Marchmont. "Miss Marchmont," I said, "tell them what you observed." She did not hesitate. "During Hastings's shot, I was near the fireplace. I could see the reflection in the glass cabinet." Mr. Clark glanced toward the study corridor before he spoke. Clark laughed quietly, as though amused by the solemnity of a reflection. "A reflection is not evidence." "No," I agreed, "but a reflection can reveal what a direct gaze may conceal, and it was not the only observation." I faced Clark again. "When I asked you to recreate your position in this room," I said, "you placed yourself at the doorway. Yet from that position, you could not have clearly seen Hastings's cue strike the ball without stepping nearer the table." Hastings nodded reluctantly. "That's true." "You therefore adjusted your story," I continued, "by conceding that perhaps you moved a little. Inches, you said, are easy to forget." Clark's jaw tightened very slightly. "Yet," I said, "inches matter. Because the nearer you stand to the corridor, the easier it is to step into it without anyone noticing. A small movement, a brief disappearance, then return. I walked a few steps toward the doorway that led to the corridor and the side entrance beyond it. And here, I said quietly, is where the house itself provided testimony. I knelt briefly and brushed my fingers along the edge of the baize near the doorway, an action I had already taken before, but repetition makes the point unavoidable. There was a faint scuff, I said. Mud, dried earth, not much, but enough. Rain had fallen heavily that night. The garden paths were wet. Captain Hastings's shoes were polished. Dr. Rowley wore slippers. Servants do not cross the bays while play is in progress. Yet mud appeared here, near the doorway closest to the garden entrance adjoining the study corridor. Lady Marchmont raised her hand to her throat. "You suggest someone came in from the garden?" Sir Reginald asked, his voice thick. "I suggest," I replied, "that someone left the study area and avoided the main hall." Clark's voice remained steady. "Even if there was mud, it proves nothing. Anyone may have tracked it in." "Not anyone," I said gently. "Not during a game. Not without being noticed. Not without a reason." I rose and returned to the center of the room, making sure all eyes followed me. A revelation is not merely a set of facts. It is an arrangement of attention. "And now," I said, "we come to timing." At that word, something shifted. People may accept poison and ledgers in the abstract, but timing makes it immediate. Timing forces the mind to see events as a chain rather than as isolated stones. "Mr. Whitfield and Mr. Clark meet at 9:30, I said. "The meeting is urgent because the ledger shows irregularities and Mr. Whitfield intends review. During the meeting, Mr. Clark offers, or permits, what appears to be a conciliatory drink. Perhaps it is brandy, perhaps it is presented as a gesture of calm after disagreement. Into that drink is introduced a small quantity of cyanide, not into the decanter, into the glass." Dr. Rowley's face was tight now, as though he were beginning to understand how his earlier conclusion might have been encouraged. "Cyanide," I continued, "acts quickly, particularly in a man with a weak heart. Mr. Whitfield collapses. There is little struggle. A locked door and a seated body create the appearance of an unfortunate, private death." Sir Reginald's knuckles whitened around his cane. "Adrian," I raised my hand slightly. "Let me finish." I looked toward the corridor. "Now Mr. Clark must return to the household," I said. "But he must return in a way that avoids questions. If he walks straight back through the main hall immediately after leaving the study, he risks being noticed at an awkward time. Someone may remark, 'You have been with Whitfield.' Someone may ask, 'How did he seem?' The murderer does not want conversation. Conversation creates details." I let my gaze travel slowly over the assembled faces. "So he uses the garden entrance adjoining the study corridor," I said. "Rain conceals his footsteps. The darkness conceals his figure. He circles and re-enters by the side door. He wipes his shoes as best he can, but a faint trace remains, mud on the baize near the doorway." Clark's eyes glittered with something like irritation, but he remained silent. "And then," I said, "he rejoins the billiard room. He is present. Yes, but presence is not enough. He must be remembered. More than that, he must be remembered at the correct time." I turned toward the mantel clock. 9 minutes past 10, I said. That is when he spoke. Sir Reginald nodded faintly, as if the certainty of the clock were now a burden. "And what was happening at that moment?" I asked. Hastings answered reluctantly. "I was about to take my shot." "Yes," I said. Hastings was preparing to strike. He had already missed once, an unusual lapse that drew attention. The room's focus was sharpened. Silence had formed naturally. It was the perfect instant to command every eye. I looked directly at Clark. "And you did," I said quietly. "You cleared your throat. You apologized. You displayed humility. You positioned yourself as honorable, reflective, incapable of malice." Clark's voice was cool. "You call it humility? Others might call it manners." "Words," I replied, "are like knives. They may be used to cut bread or to cut throats. Their moral value lies in how they are used. I turned to the others again. "Tell me," I said gently, "what do you remember most clearly from that evening?" Lady Marchmont spoke before she could stop herself. "The apology." Price nodded. "Yes, it was memorable." Hastings said gruffly, "It changed the mood." "Exactly," I said. "It altered the atmosphere. It unified you in warmth. It made you applaud, and that applause sealed something far more important than forgiveness." I paused, allowing the room to feel the weight of what I was about to say. "It sealed your memory." Their faces shifted as understanding began to form, slowly like dawn creeping into a room. "You remembered the tone," I continued. "The gesture, the dignity, but you did not remember the exact minute Mr. Clark entered the room. You assumed he had been here. You placed him here because he made you feel safe, and safe men are not suspected." I stepped closer to Clark, not aggressively, but so that he could not pretend I was addressing only the room. "You did not merely interrupt a shot," I said. "You interrupted perception itself." The fire popped softly. In that small sound, the silence seemed even deeper. Sir Reginald's voice broke. "Adrian, why? If there were business difficulties, if Whitfield threatened exposure, why not confront him honestly? Why poison him?" Clark's face remained composed, but the warmth had drained from it. "You listen to a story and call it truth." I nodded, as though accepting the challenge. "Very well," I said. "Let us speak of motive with clarity." Mr. Whitfield was preparing to advise Sir Reginald against further involvement in your ventures. He had noted excessive exposure. He had written that documentation was incomplete. He had circled figures and prepared review. If that review occurred, it might reveal not merely failure, but misrepresentation. It might expose that funds were moved without proper safeguards, perhaps without proper authority. Such exposure would destroy not only your financial prospects, but your social position here. It would remove you from this house more decisively than any insult. Price's hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. He looked as though he wished to disappear into the chair. "And you," I said, turning slightly toward Price, "are not merely an observer, Mr. Price. You are a partner. You had reason to fear review as well." Price swallowed but did not speak. Clark's eyes flicked toward Price for a fraction of a second, an involuntary movement that revealed more than words. I returned my focus to Clark. "You needed Mr. Whitfield silent," I said quietly. "And you needed yourself remembered as harmless. You created harmlessness with words. You created silence with poison." Dr. Rowley spoke abruptly. "You still have no direct proof of cyanide. No laboratory test. No confession." "Doctor," I replied, "your profession deals with bodies. Mine deals with people. When a man dies with symptoms resembling heart failure, when a glass carries bitter almond beneath brandy, when a meeting is scheduled with a man who benefits from death, when that man's movements do not align with his account, and when he performs a public act that anchors memory at precisely the right time, then the absence of a laboratory report does not create innocence. It creates only delay." Clark's voice was sharp now. "Then arrest me, if you can." I smiled slightly, not with pleasure, but with the calm of logic. "I have not relied on one piece," I said. "I have relied on the arrangement poison ledger, meeting mud, sightlines, memory." I lifted my hand, counting quietly on my fingers. 1. The brandy glass. 2. The ledger irregularities. 3. The meeting at 9:30. 4. The garden entrance and the mud. 5. The apology at 9 minutes past 10. I lowered my hand. "Each alone may be explained away," I said. "Together they form a design." Sir Reginald's shoulders sagged as if the design had become visible to him at last. "Adrian," he whispered, "tell me there is some explanation." Clark held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked away, not in guilt perhaps, but in calculation. He was, even now, considering what could be salvaged. "You call it strategy disguised as humility," Clark said at last. "I call it your imagination." "No," I replied softly. "I call it your habit. His eyes snapped back to mine. "Your apology," I continued, "was not your first performance. It was simply the one performed before the correct witnesses. You chose your moment because you understood the psychology of a room. You understood that if people admire your character, they will not question your movements. They will not notice your absence. They will fill the gaps for you." I stepped back, allowing the whole room to see him, not as a charming guest, but as a figure placed at the center of the chain. "And now," I said, "I will tell you the one thing you did not anticipate." Clark's expression tightened. "You did not anticipate," I said, "that someone in that room would not applaud." I looked toward Miss Marchmont. "She withheld alignment," I said. "She watched reflection instead of table. She noticed direction instead of words. Because of her, your apology became not merely a kindness but a clue." Miss Marchmont's face did not change, but her eyes were steady as stone. Clark's breathing deepened slightly. It was the first visible crack. "And because of her," I said, "the applause that you expected to protect, you became a signal that you had needed protection." I turned towards Sir Reginald. "Sir Reginald," I said gently, "you will contact the police. The body must be examined properly. The glass must be tested, the ledger must be secured, and you must be prepared for the possibility that this house, this stage, has harbored a far uglier drama than any of you wish to believe." Sir Reginald nodded slowly, as if each motion required effort. Clark's voice was low. "You have turned them against me with words." "With truth," I corrected. "Words may be weapon, yes. But truth is the hand that holds it steady. But elegance is not the same as invincibility. You built an alibi from admiration, and you treated memory as clay. Yet memory has a flaw. It cannot be shaped perfectly unless everyone cooperates. And in this room, one person did not cooperate." I inclined my head slightly toward him. "Applause cannot erase minutes," I said, "and minutes, when examined, do not forgive." This time, there was no applause. Only the heavy, unavoidable sound of understanding settling into place, like a final ball rolling to rest on green felt. Chapter 10 Fay, the final angle when confronted with the symmetry of the evidence. Mr. Clark's composure faltered. It was not a dramatic collapse. Mr. Adrian Clark was not the type to cry out, to fling up his hands, to become suddenly theatrical in a manner unbecoming his carefully cultivated image. His life, at least as it had been presented at Blackthorn Manor, was a sequence of controlled gestures. The measured smile, the polite nod, the calm voice that never rose, the deliberate modesty that never quite diminished him. Even under accusation, he had relied upon poise, as though it were armor. But armor, however, polished, betrays itself at the joints. There came a moment, brief, almost invisible to any eye not trained to seek it, when he ceased to calculate how he appeared. The faint amusement drained from his face. His gaze slid, not to another person, but to the mantel clock, and in that involuntary glance, the whole structure of his performance trembled. Because the clock, unlike people, cannot be persuaded. His silence followed, not a silence of indignation, not the silence of a man wrongfully accused, who cannot speak because words fail him. It was the silence of a man choosing between two losses, confession, which ruins him immediately, and denial, which ruins him inevitably. In such a silence, one hears the quiet arithmetic of self-preservation. Sir Reginald Marchmont, whose kindness had perhaps been the most exploited of all, stood very still, his cane gripped so tightly that the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. Lady Marchmont had sunk into a chair, one hand pressed to her mouth as though to contain not merely shock, but the shame of having applauded so readily. Mr. Leonard Price stared at the carpet with the fixed intensity of a man trying to erase something by refusing to look at it. Dr. Rowley's expression was strained, his professional certainty challenged by the small, bitter truth that medicine may be assisted into error by expectation. Captain Hastings stood with shoulders squared, his face grave, anger held in check by discipline. Miss Eleanor Marchmont did not move at all, I observed her with a quiet respect. She had withheld applause when it would have been easiest to join it. She had allowed her mind to remain separate from the warmth of the room. And in so doing, she had offered something more valuable than approval. She had offered doubt. It was Sir Reginald who broke the silence at last. "Poirot," he said thickly, "if what you say is true, what happens now?" Now that word always arrives in such moments. It is the word that follows illusion. It is the word that brings the practical world back into a room clouded with moral astonishment. "The authorities must be summoned," I replied gently. "Mr. Whitfield's death must be examined properly. The glass must be tested. The ledger must be secured, and statements must be taken while memory is still capable of being interrogated." Lady Marchmont made a faint sound, something between a sob and a protest. "But this is dreadful. In our house, madame," I said softly. "The house does not commit the crime. People do." Sir Reginald nodded slowly, as though each motion required effort. He did not look at Clark. That, I thought, was perhaps the cruelest judgment of all. A man can endure anger, even hatred, more easily than he can endure being regarded as a stranger. Within half an hour, arrangements were made, a message sent to the local constabulary, a servant dispatched with urgency, the sound of his footsteps quick and irregular upon the corridor floor. Blackthorn Manor, so accustomed to routine, began to shift into a new kind of order, the uneasy order of those who wait for official voices, official paper, official consequences. Clark remained where he stood. He did not attempt to flee. That would have been too crude, too obvious, too much in conflict with the careful elegance of his designs. He only watched, quietly measuring the room, perhaps still clinging to the idea that if he maintained composure long enough, composure might yet protect him. But composure is not innocence. It is merely the last habit of a man who has relied upon appearance as a shield. When the first uniformed officer arrived, followed soon after by the inspector from the nearest town, the billiard room altered once more. Authority has a way of draining warmth from a place. Paperwork has a way of stripping romance from suspicion. Names were recorded, times confirmed. A messenger sent for a medical examiner to inspect Mr. Whitfield's remains and the objects within his study. Clark was asked, quietly but firmly, to remain available for questioning. He complied. He always complied, until compliance ceased to benefit him. It was only when the inspector, having listened to my summary, asked to see the study and the ledger, that Clark's eyes tightened. Again, not dramatically, but enough. The house, so recently filled with clinking glasses and polished conversation, settled into a quiet that felt almost physical. Doors were closed more softly than usual. Servants moved with an exaggerated caution. Even the fire seemed to burn with restrained sound. Lady Marchmont retired upstairs, claiming a headache that was very likely real. Sir Reginald remained in the drawing-room, staring at a portrait of his father, as though seeking counsel from painted eyes. Mr. Price was escorted gently to a side chair and advised not to leave the premises. Dr. Rowley went reluctantly with the inspector toward the study, his professional pride wounded, but his sense of responsibility intact. Captain Hastings lingered in the billiard room with me for a few minutes longer. "Well," he said at last, voice low, "if you ask me, the man deserves what's coming." "Justice is not always identical with what one believes a man deserves," I replied. "But in this case, it will at least attempt to be identical with what he has done." Hastings frowned. "You speak as if you pity him." "I do not pity the crime," I said, "but I have often observed that those who commit such crimes do so believing themselves cleverer than the world. When the world proves otherwise, the fall is not merely legal, it is personal." He was silent for a moment, then sighed. "You have a way of making even villains sound like men." "They are men," I said gently. "That is why they are dangerous." Hastings left soon after, summoned by the inspector to provide his statement about the evening's events. I remained behind, for there are moments after the conclusion of an investigation when the mind, having pursued truth with vigor, suddenly requires stillness. It is not sentimentality, it is completion. One must allow the final angle to settle. I walked slowly toward the billiard table. The balls had been left as they were earlier in the evening's recreation, scattered in positions that were now meaningless to the game but meaningful to me. The green baize under lamplight resembled a calm surface beneath which currents moved unseen. The cues rested in their rack, silent and straight. He stood beside the table and looked down upon the arrangement. A game of billiards depends upon foresight. The player calculates angles, rebounds, the subtle influence of a cushion, the precise force required to send one ball into another so that a third will travel exactly where intended. It is not a game of brute strength, it is a game of anticipation, and anticipation, as every detective knows, lies at the heart of murder as well. Mr. Clark had calculated many things. He had calculated Mr. Whitfield's vulnerability, a weakened heart that would make poison appear natural. He had calculated the power of routine, a study door locked from within, a desk arranged neatly, a body discovered in a posture consistent with illness. He had calculated the weather, a storm that would conceal movement in the garden, soften footprints, hide sound beneath wind and rain. He had calculated social instinct, the eagerness of polite people to applaud humility, to reward a gesture that restores comfort, and most of all, he had calculated memory. He understood, perhaps better than some philosophers, that memory is not a record but a story. He understood that if he could place himself at the center of a warm story, applause, reconciliation, moral grace, then the cold minutes outside that story would become blurred. He gave the room something to feel, and because they felt it together, they remembered it together. Yes, he calculated everything, almost everything. But he miscalculated one detail, that an apology delivered for convenience betrays itself through timing. True contrition does not care for the clock. It arrives when conscience demands it, not when advantage permits it. It does not wait for a man to miss a shot, so that attention may be redirected. It does not build volume gradually in the moments before release. It does not glance toward a corridor, as though confirming a private matter before addressing a public one. Mr. Clark's apology was not an eruption of conscience. It was a device. And devices leave patterns. I leaned slightly over the table, examining the angles more closely. If the white ball struck the red at this point, it would rebound at precisely such a line, contacting the yellow with predictable consequence. The geometry was inevitable. Billiards, like logic, is merciless to those who ignore it. A player may believe he controls the game, but if he misjudges an angle, the balls will not obey his intention. They obey the laws of their movement, not the desires of their handler. So it was with Mr. Clark. He believed that by controlling the room's emotion, he controlled the room's truth. But truth has its own cushions, its own rebounds. It strikes surfaces we do not anticipate. It returns from directions the criminal has not considered. It is delayed sometimes, yes, but not prevented. I thought again of Miss Marchmont's quiet stillness by the fireplace, of her refusal to applaud, of her watchfulness in the cabinet glass. In every well-arranged crime, there is usually one overlooked detail, something the criminal deems insignificant. Often it is a physical trace, mud, ash, a smudge of ink. Sometimes it is a person, a mind not swayed by the group, a witness who looks in the wrong place. Wrong, that is, for the criminal's plan. Miss Marchmont had been that wrong place. And because of her, the apology became not a shield but a clue. He heard footsteps behind me and turned. The inspector had returned briefly, his face thoughtful, perhaps slightly troubled. "We'll need your formal statement, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "Of course," I replied. He hesitated, then asked, "You were certain it was him from the beginning?" "No," I said. "Certainty is a conclusion, not a starting point. But the apology—" "Yes," I said softly. "The apology was the beginning." He looked puzzled. I gestured toward the billiard table. "Look," I said. "A cue strikes. A ball travels. Another moves. A third responds. One might focus only on the final movement and believe it happened by chance, but it is the first strike, the initial angle, that determines everything that follows." The inspector nodded slowly. "And in this case?" he asked. "In this case," I said. The initial strike was a moment chosen too carefully to be innocent. He left then, and I remained alone again. For a minute or two, I listened to the house. It was astonishing how different Blackthorn Manor sounded now. Earlier, it had been full of confident voices, of laughter and applause. Now its sounds were cautious, a door closing softly, a servant's murmur, the distant creak of a stair. The manor had become aware of itself, aware that walls had witnessed something ugly, and that dignity, once bruised, does not recover quickly. I stood beside the billiard table and allowed my thoughts to settle into their final shape. Mr. Clark's composure had faltered not because he was accused, but because the symmetry of the evidence had trapped him. A lone clue may be dismissed, two may be argued, three may be explained away with cleverness. But when every line, financial motive, opportunity, physical trace, psychological manipulation, precise timing converges upon one man, cleverness begins to resemble desperation. His silence had confirmed what applause had once concealed. Applause is powerful. It turns doubt into comfort. It reassures people that the world is stable and that virtue is visible. But applause can also be used as camouflage. It can drown out the faint sound of footsteps returning from the garden. It can persuade the mind to ignore minutes. Yet applause cannot alter the clock, and the clock, in the end, is merciless. I glanced once more at the mantel clock. The hands moved with steady impartiality. No matter how skilled the liar, time remains indifferent to persuasion. It does not feel admiration. It does not forgive. It simply proceeds. Mr. Clark had relied upon people's good nature, their desire to believe in civility. He had relied upon their willingness to remember warmth, rather than to measure minutes. He had relied upon the fact that most people prefer narratives that make them feel safe. But I have made a profession of refusing safety when it is purchased at the price of truth. The truth, as always, was not in the words spoken, but in the moment chosen to speak them. And in that moment, 9 minutes past 10, the cue had struck too cleanly to be believed.